Horror took a turn, not necessarily for the worse, but it certainly became less serious in the 80s with the arrival of the slasher film. Teenagers being hacked to bits, often during or shortly after having sex, masked murderers stalking sorority houses, suburban streets and campsites. The days of the political and the groundbreaking were, while not exactly over, certainly dwindling in popularity and quantity. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. While there's no one universally agreed upon start date for the slasher as a subgenre, it can't be denied that John Carpenter's Halloween really solidified the idea and brought it to the mainstream. Certainly there are proto-slasher films like Michael Powell's excellent Peeping Tom, which we're probably going to do a whole video on at some point, or the Italian Giallo cycle, particularly Mario Bava's A Bay of Blood, but the film that directly inspired Halloween was Bob Clark's Black Christmas, which used the iconic points of view shot, making us look at the world through the killer's eyes a whole 4 years before Carpenter. It also prefigures the scary phone call threats from When a Stranger Calls and Scream.
Oh, why don't you go find a wall socket and stick your tongue in it? That'll give you a charge.
I'll stick my tongue up your pretty pussy.
You fucking creep!
I'm going to kill you.
Black Christmas even has a comic relief alcoholic landlady, which unfortunately wasn't copied by more successful franchises because she's my favourite part of the film. It's the first true blue slasher film, and although it didn't catch on with a very large audience, set the stage for serial murderers to completely take over the horror genre. Of course, nobody would care if Halloween hadn't gone on to become wildly popular, grossing $70 million on a budget of only $300,000, and for good reason too. Halloween is a masterpiece of tension and minimalistic mayhem, with about as bare bones a premise as you can possibly think of.
In the news tonight, top story, an escaped convict from the asylum has escaped and he's mental and he's on the loose and stuff.
Oh my god, that sounds dangerous.
Oh, I'm sure it's no biggie.
The lack of a complicated story allows the entire focus of the film to be on the execution. Carpenter's signature music and the blank white mask that escaped convict Michael Myers wears indicate that this is a primal space we're entering. There are no heady political messages or deep themes, just a psychopath and the young teenagers he's stalking. And it turns out that's all you really need with enough raw filmmaking talent. The use of long takes and the slow build-up from an average Halloween day for an average teenage girl in an average suburban town in Illinois to a frenzied struggle to survive make for one of the most simple, but also one of the most quietly visceral films in the canon of horror cinema. Halloween can also illuminate the recurring tropes to come in later films, most notably in two areas. First, Laurie Strode, the film's protagonist played by Jamie Lee Curtis, whose early career was dominated by her roles in slasher films, each time playing the final girl. For those who don't know, a final girl, or survivor girl, is a character in a slasher film almost always female and rather prudish, whose innocence and intelligence allow her to escape and or vanquish the killer. Laurie Strode is the prototypical final girl. She dresses in a rather frumpy fashion, is reluctant to even go to her high school dance, and spends her time either studying or babysitting, despite seeming to have no real interest in anything that would require her to spend money. But she's kind and smart and we like her. She's noticeably different from her friends who are either more sexually active and cynical or just really grating and annoying.
Totally.
Secondly, the killer. Slasher films, at least the ones that became popular franchises, tended to end with the killer seemingly defeated but not actually gone forever. Naturally, Halloween has probably the best ever reveal of this when Michael Myers is lying dead on the floor as Laurie sits in shock in the doorway. Laurie is the center of our attention and Michael isn't even in focus, but then he sits up. The composition of this shot is meticulously designed to freak us out. Carpenter uses the dark walls of the hallway to effectively narrow the aspect ratio, forcing us to focus on the center of the frame, on Laurie, as she struggles with what has just happened to her. In an almost silent moment, we see Michael move while keeping Laurie in the foreground, reminding us that she doesn't know she's in danger still. This fake-out death actually happens twice in Halloween, occurring once again at the very end when, after having been shot multiple times and falling out of a window, Michael Myers disappears. The film ends on a series of shots of the house seemingly innocuous and safe except for the little details that remind us of the violence that has taken place, and we hear Michael's distinctive heavy breathing before the credits roll. The implication is obvious. The danger is far from over, and the boogeyman could be anywhere. Halloween's success naturally led to a slew of inferior imitators, the vast majority of which don't have anywhere near the same amount of talent and suspense behind them. Happy Birthday to Me is about a clique of obnoxious high school students who are gradually picked off and has a twist ending that would be kind of interesting if it weren't so stupid and contrived. Prom Night begins with a group of sociopathic children who decide to lie about the death of their friend, which they inadvertently caused while playing a cruel game in this weird, oversaturated flashback sequence, and then they're gradually picked off 6 years later on their high school prom night. Terror Train follows a group of medical students who pulled a cruel prank on one of their peers and are then, you guessed it, gradually picked off while throwing a costume party aboard a train. The list goes on and on, from one unremarkable series of by-the-numbers murders of annoying and often really mean teenagers to another and another and another ad nauseum. Of course, there are good slasher films. In 1980s, Sean S. Cunningham released an unabashed rip-off of Halloween, but rather than shying away from graphic gore as Carpenter had, he made a spectacle of it with the help of special effects legend Tom Savini. Friday the 13th isn't as good as Halloween, but it does a good job of replicating the formula. Rather than the quiet town of Haddonfield, Illinois, it takes place in the quiet Camp Crystal Lake, and a group of teenagers are gradually picked off. Okay, well, it's not original, but it does have some inventive kills and a good musical motif, which cleverly reveals itself to be more than just random menacing noises at the end. You see, the reason why all the teenagers are being killed is because the one-time camp cook Pamela Voorhees' son, Jason, drowned several years ago because the teenage camp counselors were too busy having sex to make sure he was safe. Mrs. Voorhees was driven by grief to murder the current camp counselors, hoping that the camp would never be opened again. She eventually becomes completely unhinged, believing that our protagonist and final girl Alice Hardy is directly responsible for Jason's death, despite the fact that it took place before Alice was even born. She then speaks as if she herself were Jason, egging herself on and revealing what means.
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her.
Pamela Voorhees is one of the most interesting slasher villains because she's actually somewhat sympathetic, and she looks so innocuous when we first meet her. She's a far better villain than her mute son, who became the series' recurring antagonist in the endless string of sequels that cannibalize the original story and devolve into an incoherent mess that loses all of the interesting parts of the original in favor of endlessly repeating the same teenagers go to Camp Crystal Lake, Jason kills them routine. Here we see the worst effect that the slasher film had on horror cinema. Because they were relatively cheap to make and required very little imagination, the companies that owned the rights to these films could keep making more of them in a factory assembly line that makes even the latter Universal Monsters movies look fresh and creative by comparison. Every time a slasher film became popular, it would almost immediately spawn a series of dull sequels with nothing interesting to do with an already tired formula. But there were still some good first entries into slasher series, most notably Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street, which was inspired by a series of newspaper articles Craven had read about men from Southeast Asia who were having such disturbing nightmares they refused to go to sleep. When they eventually did, they suddenly died for no apparent reason. Taking this idea and applying it to the popular slasher formula, Craven revolutionized the genre by embracing surreal imagery thanks to the film's killer hook. In this world, the boogeyman attacked a group of teenagers in their dreams, but the injuries sustained there manifested in the real world, and if you died in the dream, you would die in real life. The film revitalized the already flagging slasher subgenre, with inventive deaths, a blurring of dream and reality, and a villain who actually had a personality rather than simply being a walking death machine devoid of any discernible character. The film is full of iconic moments, especially in the grisly death scenes. The first kill in the film is really quite unnerving as a young woman is dragged up the wall of her bedroom and mercilessly cut by an invisible assailant, but undoubtedly the film's most enduring scene is the torrent of blood that follows Johnny Depp's demise. Wes Craven had successfully created a classic movie monster in Freddy Krueger, who fared better than most in his inevitable sequels. Although the films are not exactly good, the second is at least trying something different, when Freddy begins to possess a teenage boy. It's also notable for being one of the gayest horror films ever made, which is an unusual approach that certainly makes it stand out. The third entry to the series, Dream Warriors, is nowhere near as scary or as much fun as the original, but it takes the action to a wholly different and altogether darker place, as the teens being menaced and murdered in this installment are residents of a psychiatric hospital. Our final girl from the first film, Nancy Thompson, has returned to try and help the current generation of victims, but the well-meaning hospital staff end up inadvertently putting their patients in grave danger when they forcefully medicate them to get them to sleep. This film has some of the most inventive and over-the-top death scenes in any slasher movie, and although it doesn't really hold together very well as a narrative, Robert Englund's Freddy is even more sadistic in this entry, while somehow also being more fun to watch.
This is it, Jennifer. Your big breaking TV. Welcome to prime time, bitch.
But even Freddy Krueger became stale after a while. Besides the admirable but ultimately not terribly successful Wes Craven's New Nightmare, in which the cast and crew of the original film became targets for a version of Freddy Krueger who bled over into reality, the Nightmare on Elm Street series wound up the same as the Halloween or Friday the 13th films, a repetitive, extremely convoluted mess with no real ideas. Let's not even get into the series that were never very good to begin with, like Child's Play or the Leprechaun movies, both of which tried to make a slasher villain about a third the size of an average person scary and never succeeded in doing so. But then, Wes Craven, not being one to let a dead genre rest, revived it again with his meta-horror comedy film Scream, which has a great opening scene using the creepy phone call trope from Black Christmas extremely effectively.
You never told me your name.
Why do you want to know my name?
I want to know who I'm looking at.
What did you say?
Then goes off the rails and becomes intolerably certain that it's far more witty and insightful than it actually is. It's a fun and mostly entertaining romp, but it's not remotely scary after the first scene and has so many annoying characters that it just becomes a farcical mess. The slasher film started to die a long, drawn-out death pretty much as soon as it became a thing, with a huge number of terrible films amid the occasional gem. Things became decidedly worse in the 2000s when Michael Bay's production company Platinum Dunes took it upon itself to remake all the notable slasher films of the 80s, but this time with the most generically attractive people who I would hesitate to call actors, all running around screaming and swearing a lot with a disgusting green-brown colour palette making everything look like a film reel that somebody threw up on before putting it in the projector. The slasher film has largely been defined by lack of inspiration and lazy opportunistic filmmaking, which is a shame because there are some truly great slasher movies, even from the 21st century. Films such as Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, a mockumentary in which slasher villains like Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger were real serial killers, and follows an aspiring slasher villain as he explains his process, sending up the inherent silliness of these films. It's a great little horror comedy, and even more recently, You're Next took the slasher film and twisted it into a violent action movie to great success. Slasher films, when done well, can be both scary and fun. They may be kind of silly and have some weirdly puritanical views about sex and drug use, but just because a film is simple doesn't mean it has no value. The slasher never really went away, and they are still being made today, albeit generally less successfully. It was, at one point, the king of horror subgenres, but its throne was taken by something altogether more gruesome. Next time, we'll look at how audiences' desensitization to violence led to an arms race of gore that ultimately ended in a complete bloodbath.